Okay, it's recording. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you're all well in these lockdown times, but it's good to have a chance to meet up again and listen to two fantastic papers. So our first paper today is going to be Livia. She'll be talking about Gerrard Winstanley's The Law of Freedom in a Platform, From Intellectual Continuity to Material Rupture. So Livia is a history PhD candidate at the Federal University of Minas Gerais under the supervision of Professor Silvia Liebel. She's currently a visiting researcher at Sheffield under the supervision of Professor Michael Braddick. Her research explores radical identity formation and dispute through print during the British Civil Wars, with a particular focus on the diggers. And the paper she's about to present is an extract from a chapter that Livia's written for a new modern utopia organised by Professor Liebel, which is currently in press in Brazil. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Livia. We'll listen to her paper and then we'll have a chance for some questions afterwards. Over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. Should I start sharing my screen now?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Just a second. Okay. So hello everyone. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here, sharing a little bit of my work with you. Secondly, please do excuse my English. This is the first time I make such a presentation in English, and pardon if I stumble around my words a little bit. So the presentation I bring to you today is a paper about Gerrard, the Law of Freedom. And when reading about the pamphlets and broadsides attributed to the Diggers, a radical group that took action during the 17th century British Civil Wars, one thing that always caught my attention was the way in which many historians and scholars refer to the last of these pamphlets as being a utopia. The Law of Freedom in a Platform, or True Magistracy Restored, published in 1652, allegedly written by the now famous digger Gerrard Winstanley, was to be sold at the Bedspread Eagle by Giles Calvert. The copy I'll be analyzing here today is the one of the British Library, and it has 89 pages. What caught my attention, however, was not only that this last pamphlet was generally deemed a utopia, but the fact that little to none theoretical explanations were properly given to support or explain such characterization. Why should we understand the Law of Freedom as a utopia, and what does this tell us about the nature and the significance of this particular digger tract? The first scholar to reference this pamphlet as a utopia was Edward Bernstein in the 19th century. Other names that have referred to it in such terms include J.C. Davies, John Gurney, Walter Murphy, Christopher Hill, and Glenn Bowman, to name but a few. While the justification for such characterization was absent, one thing that was strikingly clear is the way in which the vast majority of these scholars considered this pamphlet to be a big rupture in contrast to earlier digger writings, a major change in political and religious stances, and in addition to that, a product of the experience of defeat theorized by Christopher Hill. In 1991, J.C. Davies went as far as affirming that Winstanley went from anarchism to utopianism with the Law of Freedom. Now, in terms of ideas and intellectual positions, I argue that there was no such great rupture between this pamphlet and its predecessors. My perspective is that this final work seems so alien to us when compared to previous digger writings, not because of its intellectual characteristics, but because of its more material ones, as well as its more descriptive nature. The rupture is in the way in which Winstanley structured and presented his text, which indeed leads me to consider it a utopia. For starters, this is the first time that the society so passionately defended by Winstanley in his previous pamphlets is finally described at length and with great quantity of details. The pamphlet is divided in 5 parts: a dedication to Oliver Cromwell, a preface to the friendly and unbiased reader, chapters 1 to 6, a table of contents, a list of 5 pamphlets previously written by Winstanley before his involvement with the Diggers, which were also to be sold at the Black Spread Eagle by Giles Covert. So as you can see, this is the dedication to Cromwell. This is the preface to the friendly and unbiased reader, chapters 1 to 6, final list with a table of contents, and the last part, which is this indication of previous Winstanley's writings to be sold at the Black Spread Eagle. So throughout these chapters, Winstanley exposes to his readers his ideas of how a truly free Commonwealth should be structured. Similar to his previous works, he relies extensively on the scriptures to substantiate his views. Like in his previous tracts, biblical passages and references are used metaphorically in order to illustrate his opinions, such as the story of Cain and Abel, as well as the horror of Babylon, for example. The Norman yoke also continues to be a constant reference, attributing the origin of buying and selling, land enclosures, and all other so-called oppressions that were affecting England in the 17th century to the Norman invasion in the 11th century. In this pamphlet, once again, Winstanley dedicates quite a considerable amount of lines to explaining his concept of common freedom and how it is directly connected to the free common use of the earth. When describing his ideal commonwealth, he defends the idea that adequate, intelligible, and accessible laws should be adopted in order to regulate almost every instance of human life, from the organization of government per se to marriage and family life, for, and I quote Winstanley here, when the right-ordered laws do rule, the government is healthful. But when the will of officers rule above the law, the government is diseased with a moral disease. Hence, good laws and good officials are indispensable for a good, healthy commonwealth. Now, in the 4th chapter, he even presents us with an organization scheme illustrating how are the righteous officers within each part of the Commonwealth. Such a visual depiction has never before been employed in any other tracts associated with Winstanley or the Diggers. In the final chapters, Winstanley talks about education, schools, trades, explaining, for example, the age division within the society. Childhood and youth go from birth until 40 years of age, during which period the individual is only allowed to undertake education and practical labor. Adulthood goes from 40 to 60 years of age, when he can actually become an official within the Commonwealth. And finally, from 60 years of age onwards, the individual is regarded as a senior member of society, being then able to occupy very specific positions within the government. In these last 2 chapters, Winstanley also describes how the educational system would work, with the characteristic of valorizing practical and manual labor over intellectual activities, for instance, and concludes this final chapter presenting and explaining the 62 laws that would exist within this Commonwealth. But we're still left with the main question: what makes this pamphlet a utopia? By characterizing this last tract as such, does it mean that Winstanley had actually giving up any hopes of bringing his conjectures into reality? In order to answer these questions, we have to first differentiate utopia from utopianism. We're probably all familiar with Thomas More's coinage of the word in the 16th century, putting together the Greek words utopia, the good place, and utopia, the no place. But nowadays, the word is largely utilized with quite a variety of meanings and intentions as well, from allegedly unattainable political views to extreme optimism, and even a pejorative connotation, as argued by Lewis Mumford, for example. I agree with the political scientist L.T. Sargent when he postulates that without boundaries, we do not have an object. So I shall clarify what I mean by utopia in this particular case. In Sargent's perspective, while utopianism is regarded as a broader phenomenon which covers various aspects of social dreaming, in which are located the cocaine and the gold age, for example. A utopia is but an expression of utopianism, with the possibility of being more specifically defined by Sargent as a non-existent society described in considerable detail and normally located in time and space, with emphasis in describing social structures and the specific type of government, and, most importantly, an ideal society which is the product of human labor and not by nature, divine intervention, or yet of the existence of a perfect set of individuals. This does not, however, necessarily entail that it cannot eventually become reality, a point in which Sargent differs abruptly from J.C. Davies, who considers utopias to be exclusively pure fiction. Interestingly enough, Davies considers the Diggers to be one of the exceptions to these rules, considering that before turning to utopia in The Law of Freedom, they were filled with millenarian expectations around the perfect moral republic, and actually believed this could eventually become reality. Nevertheless, Davies still considers that The Law of Freedom was written with no concrete intentions of it becoming reality whatsoever, hence stressing his anachronic idea that Winstanley was once an anarchist who became a utopian. Thus, we can perceive utopias as literary formats, usually carrying criticism to the context in which they were written, which in the case of not only Winstanley's Law of Freedom, but also More's Utopia, which is, the case of not only Winstanley's Law of Freedom, but also More's Utopia. So in a way, The Law of Freedom ticks many of the boxes that a text would have to tick in order to be considered a literary utopia. Not only it describes Winstanley's ideal society in great quantity of detail, but even some of its themes, even some of the themes it explores can be somewhat allocated within a certain early modern utopian tradition. The ideas of a nation of farmers, the necessity for harsh laws and punishment, and also the use of gold and silver in an extremely ordinary way for daily objects in use, to cite but a few examples, which were present in Thomas More's Utopia as well. But another issue that I'd like to address is the perception that The Law of Freedom characterized a great rupture of ideas, if compared to previous writings by Winstanley in The Diggers, with which I strongly disagree. In order to illustrate my point, I would like to draw attention to Winstanley's dedication to Cromwell, which, for scholars like Davies, is a clear indication of not only Winstanley's apparent profound change of heart, but also of his bitterness and hopeless face of the defeat of the Digger experiment. Whilst in their previous pamphlets, Winstanley and the Diggers were indeed always very vocal about their critics about social hierarchies within English 17th century society, and very critical about current perceptions regarding authority, famously refusing to take off their hats inside a court when they were being inquired about the occupation on St. George's Hill in 1649, seeking to establish a certain dialogue with said authorities was never ruled out as a strategy when trying to make themselves heard in their pamphlets. On the contrary, this was a very important component of Digger political strategy. As we can see in many of the previous pamphlets, like the ones I'm showing you on this slide, appeal to different types of authority, from Lord Fairfax and the New Model Army, to the Parliament, to the Council of War, and even to the ministers of the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, was something common within the Diggers' writing strategy. All these pamphlets were published throughout the Digger experience between 1649 and 1650. And as you can see, the first one is addressing Lord Fairfax and the Council of War. The second one is an appeal to the House of Commons, and the third one is an appeal to the Parliament and the army. Consequently, the fact that Winstanley addresses Cromwell directly in his last pamphlet doesn't seem so disparate when we analyze together with his previous tracts, even though this was the first and only time he wrote to the Lord Protector as a dedication, as an extract, an extra part of the pamphlet. The same applies to all the other ideas and strategies promoted in the Law of Freedom. It can all be addressed back to previous publications. Lastly, what then drove Winstanley to write in such a format and include this dedication to Cromwell, if not the bitterness of defeat, as so many scholars argue? The question, in my opinion, lies in the context. In the dedication to Cromwell, Winstanley states that he actually wrote the Law of Freedom back in 1649, finally deciding not to publish it. But then, after reading what I quote, Mr. Peters and some other propounded this request, he decided to finally publish his final tract in 1652. And it should also be noted that we have at first no great reason to suspect that he's lying somehow, because in 1649 the Diggers were in such big trouble with local authorities that nothing really leads us to believe that he would actually want to draw Cromwell's attention to the fact that they were disrupting so many places back in 1649. So we can take into account that he probably rewrote it in 1649. So who is this Miss Peters that Winstanley is referring? Mr. Peters is probably a reference to Hugh Peters, a Puritan preacher and a notorious supporter of Parliament and regicide, whom in diverse occasions presented advices to Cromwell and his fellow companions, addressing them sometimes through print. Finally, in 1652, Peters published a pamphlet titled Good Work for a Good Magistrate, where he shared his opinions on a variety of subjects concerning the paths the Commonwealth in England should take after the regicide. After this, Peters was actually invited by Cromwell and his government to actually participate in a Parliament committee about the reformation of English laws. So probably Peters' example prompted Winstanley, and as well as the other radicals, to at least try the same, as the context of 1652 was considerably different from that of 1649, for the government gained considerable strength after the defeat of Charles II's forces in the Battle of Worcester in 1652. So radicals like Winstanley probably perceived this new phase of the Commonwealth as something that demanded slightly different approaches and types of action and strategy, but which nevertheless were not radically different from the ones they had previously pursued. With all this in mind, we can conclude that the Law of Freedom, much more than an expression of utter defeat and hopelessness, should be actually understood in the opposite way, a last hopeful attempt to influence the directions England was taking after the regicide, and thus making Winstanley and the Diggers' voice finally heard. It was a last attempt of hope instead of just the utter expression of the bitterness of defeat. Thank you.
Am I unmuted? I've unmuted. Well, thanks, Livia, for such a great paper. That was really fascinating to hear more about Gerrard Winstanley's works. I don't know why I keep calling him Gerald. So I think we'll open the floor to questions now. As the speaker, I'd quite like to, or as the host, I'd quite like to ask the first question. And I'm interested in finding out from you a bit more about Gerrard Winstanley's ideas that he outlined in The Law of Freedom. And you said it was originally written in 1649, and also that obviously the idea of legal equality plays quite a major role in his ideas. And I was wondering how much kind of intellectual continuity there was from the Diggers and their ideas and previous groups like the Levellers, who obviously put forward their final agreement of the people in 1649. And again, legal equality was kind of a major role in that. And I was wondering how much they borrowed from each other's ideas.
Should I answer?
Yeah, please.
So thank you. I just realized I think my camera was off. I thought it was on. So Gerrard Winstanley's ideas regarding legal equality have always been present within the Diggers' tracts and also his previous tracts, but maybe not so clearly or so centered as in the Leveller tracts. I think in the Leveller's concepts, political equality and the whole idea regarding suffrage was a lot more vocal, whereas in the Diggers and Winstanley's tracts, millenarian perspectives surrounding the equality of all people and the restoration of earth and the actual access to use the earth in a common way were more central. But yet, when he's making his argument in defense of this free common use of the earth, he ultimately is drawing from the Bible the idea that God created men all equal. So I think it's more in this sense. He kind of tries to appeal to this and mobilize this idea of equality between people, but not necessarily just legal voting equality as the Levellers.
Yeah.
But definitely in the Law of Freedom, as he's diving more deeply in the structure of this commonwealth that he was defending, that he was arguing for, he ends up giving more attention to how this political structure would work. Who would be able to elect the representatives and the officials. So, for example, when he stipulates this difference between who is youth, who is senior, who is an adult, and he stipulates the age of 40 until you're able to actually act politically within his commonwealth, in my perception, he's actually putting a bit of his own experience within it, because he was around 40 when he allegedly heard the message from God to make the earth a common treasure and for everyone. So even though he is against the hierarchies that were established in England in the 17th century as they were, when he theorizes about his own society in the Law of Freedom, he kind of presents somewhat a new kind of hierarchy. For example, men and women are not at all the same political subjects in his commonwealth still, even though he actually defends the fact that girls should be educated and should be taught to read and write. But not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I mean, it is still the 17th century, so they've still got to have, women and men can't be equal in the 17th century, even if you are a sort of visionary. But no, that was a great answer to the question. I'm going to let someone else ask a question now. So if anyone wants to ask a question, if you could use the waving hand function, and we'll get to you. Don't all rush at once. Any questions? Hi. Mike, could you ask?
Hi. Thanks very much, Livia. I've got a terrible connection, so apologies if I drop out. I thought that was really persuasive, actually, and I've read these texts, I'd never really pondered that difference between 1649 and 1652. Seeing it in a 1649 context, it does look much more like an alternative to the agreement of the people as a sort of blueprint for the settlement of the whole kingdom, as opposed to the rules by which a particular community is living in a digging experiment. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more. You said something about the 1649 context, but do you know more precisely when in 1652 he published it, and why he thought in 1652 it might be the time where a settlement for the whole kingdom might be open? Because obviously, you know, the following year there was considerable constitutional upheaval. I just wonder if you thought a bit more about the 1652 context. You can see why in 1649 he decided to keep his mouth shut, but I wonder why in if you've got a bit more political context for why 1652 seemed more propitious.
Thank you for the question, Professor. So comparing 1649 and 1652, I don't really think, just for starter, I don't think that he actually decided to keep his mouth shut in 1649 because of the persecution the diggers were suffering or anything like that. I get the idea that he was overall a bit unsure about the structure itself of the text, because he actually kept publishing a lot in 1649, but he was still investing a lot more in these pamphlets where he was still arguing for the establishment of the rightful kingdom of Christ on earth, and the land as a common treasure for all, and so on and so forth. And he was still trying to establish these dialogues. All those pamphlets I brought on the slides, they were all kind of trying to establish this rhetoric of addressing something that had happened at a digger commune, or addressing something that had happened, I don't know, a pamphlet or a news book was comparing the diggers to ranters or even the levelers in the beginning of 1649. So I get the sense that in 1649, they were still in this very vivid radical dispute with other radical groups, trying to articulate these perceptions and actions. Whereas in 1652, well, thinking about the diggers' case more specifically, all the communes, all the campings, let's say, all the occupations they built on till then had been voraciously undertaken by local, not even local authorities in many cases, but locals. They were persecuted, they were cast out, their houses were burned down, their crops were burned down. So I think in 1652, it's quite safe to say that the experiment was quite demobilized. So I think that when Winstanley perceives all these other pamphlets being published with this trying to mobilize this attention on the part of Cromwell, trying to actually dedicate it to him, to actually try to get this same experience that happened to Peters, I think this is a great motivation for him, because he doesn't have the digger experiment anymore. He doesn't have the occupations. But he can, and then in the example of Peters, he says, well, maybe this is one last chance. And also, I think, like I previously mentioned, I think the Commonwealth in general, as established government, was way more a lot more well established in 1652 than it was in 1649. Maybe this general perception that, you know, the paths for England were open and many projects and disputes could be ravaged on, was still a very 1649 feeling, a very 1649 sentiment, whereas in 1652 maybe the political perception was one in the way of, well, the Commonwealth is a reality, Cromwell is a reality. If we want to push any of the items in our agenda, we'll probably have to do that through them. We'll probably have to articulate it with this established new government. Again, not sure if I answered the question. I hope I did. It was a very interesting question. Thank you.
That's a very good answer. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Livia. I've got a mailing question from Veronica, who is unfortunately unable to ask her question in person. But she says she would like to know a little bit more about the production and distribution of the pamphlets. You mentioned Giles Calvert is obviously a very famous radical publisher, and she was wondering if you have any further information on his connections with Winstanley.
Thank you, Veronica. So I'm actually looking into that now. I think we even spoke about it a couple of weeks ago. I'm still trying to understand the relation because I haven't still been able to build a relation between Calvert and the Diggers beyond the fact that I think it's very well established in historiography nowadays that Calvert had this tendency of publishing radical tracts, but not exclusively Digger ones. He was publishing Winstanley's pamphlets even before he got involved with the Diggers, and he carried on publishing a great number of Digger pamphlets and broadsides throughout the 49 and 50 to 52. And actually, I'm trying to find out because I found out a couple months ago that actually the Law of Freedom in a Platform had a reprint a couple months later. Yeah, and the only difference that I could identify is that in the second version of it, there's an indication of the initials of the actual printer. I still haven't been able to find out who that was.
What were the initials?
Let me check on the first page. Just a second. Over here. The initials are JM.
JM.
Yeah, I think it was a printer that ended up leaving for Massachusetts later on, but I'm not sure.
Really? Okay. I'm sure it's Moxon's. There's one who wrote the history of the art of printing, and his brother, and they were both initially involved in kind of radical printing. I'm sure Veronica will know a lot more about it than I do, but it just rings a bell. But anyway, that's complete speculation on my part.
Oh, but up until now, I've been only speculating about him.
Yeah, that's normally the way. I've spent too much of my PhD speculating about printers' initials. Yeah. But I guess, I mean, in terms of the actual connection, it doesn't necessarily need to be a personal one. On the Law of Freedom, you said at the back, Calvert was advertising the other pamphlets that he had already published. And he's obviously widely known as the kind of place to go if you want to buy these things. So maybe he just saw a vendable pamphlet, something exciting that would obviously cause a stir, and it got reprinted again. So I wonder if there doesn't need to be a kind of personal reason from doing it other than the fact that he thinks he can make money out of it, and he probably agrees with some of the ideas.
Yeah. And also about like Calvert's publishing it and reprinting it, and maybe an indication that it was quite well, it did well in the market. I've been taking a look at some news books because apparently some extracts of the Law of Freedom were also published in some news books, of course, criticizing it before this reprint. Yeah. So I'm getting the sense that maybe, there was this first publication. It was commented a bit in these news books, and probably Calvert thought, oh, maybe, I'm going to do a reprint because as it's been circulating in news books, maybe it's going to, sell well if I reprint it. Yeah. I have to find that out now.
It's really interesting. Well, are there any final questions for Livia? If so, raise your virtual hand. Okay. Well, thanks again, Livia. I'm sure if we're all here, we'll be giving you a rapturous round of applause now, but you'll have to accept virtual silence. But it was a fantastic talk, and again, thanks a lot for giving up your time this evening.
Thank you very much.
That was great. So next on the agenda, we have Emily Hull, and she is giving us a paper entitled Irving Kristol, Cold War Liberal and Conservative. Emily's a PhD student at the UCL Institute of the Americas, and she's funded by a Wolfson Postgraduate Scholarship in the Humanities. Emily's thesis uses the life of Irving Kristol, the ex-Trotskyist turned godfather of neoconservatism, to explore transformations in American intellectual and political life during the 20th century. So I will hand over to Emily now, and if everyone can make sure they're on mute.
And thanks for a great paper, Livia. I'm just sharing my screen. Hopefully this works. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me to speak, and for the great paper that went before me. So first off, a little bit about Irving Kristol. So Irving Kristol was born in 1920 in Brooklyn, New York City, to first-generation Eastern European immigrants. Kristol is best known for his establishment of the neoconservative movement in the 1970s, but he also had a radical youth and liberal midlife. In the 1930s, Kristol was a Trotskyist, but by the 1940s, his literary talent and politics led to his association with a group called the New York Intellectuals. The New York Intellectuals were radical turned liberal writers centered around two magazines, Partisan Review and Commentary, pictured on the screen, and were heavily involved with Cold War liberal politics during this period. In 1965, Kristol moved away from Cold War politics and founded the Public Interest with lifelong friend sociologist Daniel Bell, a regular column in the Wall Street Journal, and the founding of the National Interest in 1985 finalized his transition from radical to neoconservative. My research uses Kristol's extraordinary life and intellectual trajectory to examine intellectual political trends in America in the 20th century. So here I examine Kristol's political commitments during the 1950s, analysing the process by which his liberal anti-communism morphed into an interest in conservatism. I argue that by retaining his liberal identity, whilst expressing increasingly hardline anti-communist rhetoric and nurturing a developing interest in conservatism, Kristol's politics were in flux. He was both a Cold War liberal and a conservative. Kristol has received little sustained historiographical attention. He mainly appears as a cameo figure in literature dealing with wider topics such as the New York Intellectuals. Studies where he appears in this period are largely focused on the CIA funding of intellectual activities in Western Europe through the Congress for Cultural Freedom. I seek to move beyond current literature, which is principally concerned with identifying which intellectuals knew what about CIA involvement and accuses them of selling out. Instead, by focusing on Kristol, I reveal the interesting intellectual transformations which were taking place in this period and show that there were other issues to discuss beyond the funding. Firstly, some context about the politics of the era. The 1950s marked the height of the era in America. The so-called fall of China, Stalin's possession of atomic weapons, and the phenomenon of McCarthyism made communism a hot topic in America. It was against this background that Kristol wrote his first major article, Civil Liberties, 1952, A Study in Confusion. Do we defend our rights by protecting communists? Here he infamously charged, for there is one thing that the American people know about Senator McCarthy. He, like them, is unequivocally anti-communist. About the spokesman for American liberalism, they feel they know such thing. This provocative statement would haunt Kristol for the rest of his career, with critics branding the article rabidly anti-communist, and it was this perception that was key to Kristol's appointment in the American Committee for Cultural Freedom in 1952. The American Committee for Cultural Freedom was an American affiliate of the Congress for Cultural Freedom based in Europe. The Congress was formed of a variety of European and American intellectuals who were all concerned by the growing prestige of the Soviet Union amongst writers and artists in Europe in the early 1950s. Throughout its history, the Congress published a number of magazines in Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Australia, and India. Kristol stayed in the position of executive director of the ACCF, the American affiliate for Congress, a mere 10 months, and described the period as tedium interspersed with crises. However, whilst working there, leading anti-communist Sidney Hook informed Kristol that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was interested in starting an English language magazine in Europe and needed an editor. Encounter, launched in 1953 in London, Kristol and the British poet Stephen Spender served as editors. Kristol managed the journal's political side and Spender the literary content. The opening editorial declared that Encounter seeks to promote no line, though its editors have opinions they will not hesitate to express. This declaration became noteworthy when a series of explosive articles in the New York Times and radical journal Ramparts, published between 1966 and 1967, revealed that the CIA had secretly channeled money to Encounter via the CCF. The exposés rocked the intellectual community surrounding the Congress, and those involved with its activities were branded traitors by the emergent New Left. Kristol had actually been replaced by American Melvin Lasky in 1958, but was nonetheless tainted by the scandal. Worse still, in 1967, ex-CIA staff member Tom Braden revealed that a CIA agent had actually become an editor of Encounter. With Lasky and Kristol the only American editors of the publication, suspicion naturally fell upon Kristol. Kristol wrote little on the scandal. He claimed that it was not a particularly interesting story and that the history of Encounter had been well told in historiography. Where he did write about the affair, he downplayed the idea of conspiracy. He reminded readers that this was not his first experience of working for a sponsored magazine. Indeed, in the 1940s, he had worked for the American Jewish Committee magazine, Commentary, and he emphasized the similarities between Commentary and Encounter. Moreover, he drew attention to his lack of influence in the 1950s. He may have established himself as a New York intellectual, but he was quick to point out the limited influence of the group, describing their universe as hermetic and noting that they wrote mainly for one another, not out of cliquishness, but because no one else seemed much interested. Additionally, he had never spoken at a conference, received a foundation grant, nor written for national publications by the time he became editor of Encounter. It therefore seems more likely that Lasky, not Kristol, was the CIA agent. Nevertheless, that the finger was pointed at Kristol does demonstrate the strength of his anti-communism in this period. For example, in the first issue of Encounter, Kristol published Leslie Fiedler's article, A Postscript to the Rosenberg Case. Fiedler, a fellow former Trotskyist, argued that there had been two versions of the explosive espionage case: the actual trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and the subsequent mythologized version of events. Despite ultimately concluding that the Rosenbergs should not be executed, Fiedler disparaged the couple throughout the article and never wavered from his belief in their guilt. The article resulted in much anger. CCF Secretary General Nicholas Nabokov wrote to Spender asking him to quell the fury. Kristol's decision to publish the piece was out of touch with the mood of many European intellectuals. Meanwhile, the Times Literary Supplement found that the political content of the journal was characterized by a negative liberalism, or whose main feature, at least, appears to be a hatred and fear of communism. As political editor, this criticism was clearly directed towards Kristol. He fought back in the subsequent editorial of Encounter, writing, "Liberals ought not to be exclusively concerned with communism. Only lunatics are exclusively concerned with any single thing. Liberals ought to be concerned with all changes and reforms tending in the direction of democracy. But the fact that communism today rules 1/3 of the human race and may soon rule more, and that it is the most powerful existing institution which opposes such changes and reforms as liberalism proposes, why then should not liberals, and liberals especially, hate it?" The comment reinforced Kristol's liberal self-identity and legitimised his particular conception of liberalism, which was centred on a distrust of communism and a genuine belief that it threatened international politics. Throughout his following 5 years at Encounter, Kristol continued to communist thought. In one such article, he suggested that French intellectuals revered the Marquis de Sade, an infamous philosopher known for his violent and sexually explicit writing, for the same reasons that they admired communism. He proposed that In both cases, they find themselves apologising for hideous cruelty as being, in some dialectical way, liberating. Given that the statement followed a description of Sard as a man who defended infanticide, rape, and allied activities, Kristol's extreme hatred of communism was plain. Such rhetoric cast doubt over his later claim that by the time he came to encounter anti-communism or anti-Marxism or anti-Marxist-Leninism or anti-totalitarianism had pretty much ceased to interest him as an intellectual project. However, he did explore new ideas in London. In addition to mixing with a number of Labour MPs in London, he also became friendly with young conservative journalists. These new friends included Punch editor Malcolm Muggeridge, The Spectator political columnist Henry Fairley, Daily Telegraph contributor Colin Welch, and Peregrine Wolfson, an upper-class Tory who moved from the Times to the Daily Telegraph over his controversial views on McCarthyism. Significantly, Kristol gave these new acquaintances a voice and encounter. In January 1956, the magazine's editorial, The New Conservatism, noted the revival of conservative politics in Britain and America. The editorial indicated the publication's commitment to including conservative spokesmen in its pages and Kristol's own willingness to engage with them. The influence of these new friends was apparent in Kristol's writing too. Discussing the decline of the English caste system, he wrote, "One cannot put off doomsday forever, and the time is fast approaching when there will be only one great name and one great family, call it demos. To an American like myself, this is not likely to appear to be the unmitigated catastrophe it will seem for others. But again, as an American, reared in a profoundly disestablished country, I am perhaps more aware than some of what will be lost in the way of continuity, stability, and graciousness." Moreover, he concluded, "Your establishment exists all right, and is no fevered figment of the imagination. Take pleasure in it while you can, for it will not be for long." This suggested that Kristol believed the caste system should be treasured. Such praise was unexpected from a man who 50 years had sought the destruction of class through his involvement with Trotskyism. However, they reflected the attitudes of his new friends in London, such as Wolfson, who thought that a classless society is not a good but an evil. Indeed, Kristol was so heavily influenced by these friends, in 1961 he admitted to Sidney Hook that whilst he was too old to be an angry young Tory, Tory radicalism does fairly describe my present state of mind. Yet, Kristol's writing in this period did not just reflect the influence of his new friends. Kristol's wife, Gertrude Himmelfarb, an expert on Victorian England, was also interested in conservatism. Her first book, Lord Acton, A Study in Conscience and Politics, received great acclaim in Britain. Despite its primary concern with Lord Acton's attitudes towards liberalism and Catholicism, she also considered the impact of Burke on Acton's thinking. This analysis demonstrated her interest in conservatism and knowledge of its history in Britain. Her second book, Darwin and the Darwinian Revolution, also demonstrated this expertise and emphasised the conservative elements of the so-called revolution. Meanwhile, in her contribution to Encounters, Men and Ideas series, incidentally the only one she published while Kristol was editor there, she discussed the career of Thomas Malthus, the English economist who argued that population growth would outpace food supplies. Here she suggested that Malthus was primarily a moralist, and although she ultimately saw Malthus as a fraud, displayed her admiration of Victorian values. Himmelfarb's gratitude to Kristol in the prefaces of her books provide evidence of his direct engagement in her work. So does private correspondence between Kristol and his friend Daniel Bell, in which Kristol boasted that the book will establish his wife's academic reputation forever and ever. His review of the spare Chancellor, The Life of Walter Bagehot, demonstrated the clearest indication of her influence on him. He wrote that Bagehot, like so many of his contemporaries, displayed a powerful detachment from democracy which he was committed to, and it is precisely this combination of detached attachment that makes Victorian thought on the problems of liberty and democracy, despite all conflicting emphasis and variation in specific opinion, so supremely sane. The appreciation of Victorian values and their rationality clearly stemmed from his wife's important scholarship on the topic, and moreover showed the couple's developing intellectual affinity. However, we must be careful not to brand Kristol a conservative at this point. Much of his work remained limited to book reviews, which dealt favourably with liberal conceptions of capitalism. Additionally, he reviewed socialist literature and on one occasion even concluded that the socialist world needn't be a bad world. His interest in conservatism seemed primarily anthropological. In his memoirs, Wolfson wrote that Kristol was concerned less to condone and condemn than to understand. Kristol's memoirs also suggest a sense of detachment from conservatism. He recalled that he hadn't known any conservatives in New York, only ex-radicals. He also claimed that he was fascinated by these English conservatives. In particular, he was intrigued by this group because they were, after all, heirs to a long tradition of conservative politics and conservative thought in Britain, whereas there was no such tradition in the United States. This attitude echoed the growing authority of Lionel Trilling's The Liberal Imagination, pictured on the screen. The collection of Trilling's literary criticism dealt with literature's relationship with liberalism and argued, in the absence of conservative thought, that it was liberals' responsibility to criticise themselves. Trilling famously wrote that, in the United States at this time, liberalism is not only the dominant tradition, but the sole intellectual tradition. In the post-war years, there was some effort to engage with conservatism. Historians such as Russell Kirk and Peter Viereck trace a heritage for American conservative thought. Additionally, in 1945, public intellectual William F. Buckley launched National Review with the aim of creating a national conservative movement in America. However, self-confessed conservatives were still novel in America. Trilling's conviction that liberalism was America's sole intellectual heritage was clear inspiration for Kristol's own belief that the United States lacked a conservative tradition in America, and explains his own concern with conservatism. Nor was his curiosity unique. The Kristol's close friends remained older Jewish ex-radicals in London, and they regularly hosted Daniel Bell, Lionel and Diana Trilling, Sidney Hook, and Nathan Glazer in London. Wolfson recalled being invited to meet these figures in his biography. He wrote that he found himself completely out of his depth amongst them, but this did not seem to matter. Having previously only read about English conservatism in their history books, the New York intellectuals were delighted to meet someone who embodied it rather more colourfully than most of the gloomy American conservative academics. Ever engrossed in ideas, this group were captivated by the novelty of English conservatism, represented by Kristol's new friends in London. In this way, not only was his new interest important to his own intellectual trajectory, but it also enabled him to serve as an important facilitator in the exchange of ideas across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, despite later claims otherwise, this beneficial exchange did not extend to the editors. Spender found Kristol arrogant, and Kristol thought Spender condescending. It was therefore not surprising that in 1958, following a series of editorial disputes, Kristol resigned from Encounter. In 1968, reflecting on his participation in Cold War activities, Kristol wrote, "One frequently hears it said these days, in a completely matter-of-fact way, that liberal anti-communists were obsessed by the spectre of communism." Kristol's thought during the 1950s was undeniably preoccupied with communism. It was his anti-communism which secured Kristol's position within the liberal anti-communist apparatus in the first place, as the executive director of the ACCF and later as the editor of Encounter. But more importantly, here he was exposed to a community beyond the New York intellectuals, which sparked a curiosity in conservatism. The 1950s therefore saw Kristol's political voice in a state of flux as he embraced liberal anti-communism and conservatism together. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily, for that. It's a really interesting paper about someone that I previously knew nothing about. So thanks for telling us about Irving Kristol. I'm going to open the floor to questions. Again, if anyone wants to ask a question, just use the hand function or type it in the chat. I will ask the first question if that's okay. Unless there's... Danny, do you have your hand up? I can't see.
I do, sorry.
Sorry,
the screen's there. Well, first of all, thank you for that fantastic paper. It's really interesting insight into that. Why do you think then that Kristol found English conservative traditions more inspiring than American? conservative traditions?
Thanks, that's a really great question. I think so. Most of the people he was friends with back in New York were all involved in this sort of like liberal anti-communist politics, and the conservatives they met in America were seen as sort of almost like freaks. They laughed about them. They were seen as particularly extreme. And when he comes to London, he meets these figures, and they're respected. And I think they have like a respectable version of conservatism, which is less extreme and more mainstream, which he hasn't experienced before.
I sort of feel like a little bit that the interest in Victorian England is a little bit how Americans feel about Downton Abbey at the moment. There's like something that they find strangely captivating about upper class English people from the 19th century, which I don't really understand. But
no, I think that's true. There's one article that gets published by Nancy Mitford, one of the Mitford sisters, magazine, and it's called You and Non-You, and it's the most bizarre article. It lists different words you use if you're upper class and different words you use if you're lower class. So if you use notepaper, you're upper class, but if you say writing paper, you're lower class. And if you say things like cheers, that makes you lower class, apparently. And it goes on like this. And the responses from the English like academics, they go on for a year. And the people back in New York just don't understand it, and they just think it's utterly bizarre that people are rowing about this for so long. But yeah.
So strange. I was going to ask to what extent, I mean, I may be completely wrong. I have no idea about the New York intellectuals, but to what extent Irving Kristol's kind of intellectual trajectory compared to his friends in New York?
Yeah, so most of this group, the New York intellectuals, all move rightwards. They all start off involved in some form of communist politics, usually always anti-Stalinist, and they all move years, but right of them all, and becomes what they call the godfather of neoconservatism. And he actually ends up endorsing Ronald Reagan in 1980 and becomes heavily involved in the Reagan administration. And his son goes on to become involved in the Bush administration as well.
Okay. Yeah, so that actually follows on to, I was going to ask a follow-up question, which was to what extent does Irving Kristol's intellectual trajectory map onto a kind of general to the right in America, whereby even on the left you get obviously strong anti-communist ideas kind of lean towards a more centrist, towards moving to the right trajectory. I didn't phrase that very well, but
so I think from the research I've done so far, like reading his articles and his personal papers, it very much seems that he provides an intellectual sort of support for the conservative movement, which it seems to lack. It in 1964 with Barry Goldwater, conservatism is kind of seen as this like out there kind of thing, and it's pretty racist, and there's a lot going on, but these intellectuals help make it seem more mainstream and provide like legitimate arguments for it. Yeah,
and the same with the Buckley guy, I forget his first name.
William Buckley.
Yeah, because he has really high profile debates with Noam Chomsky as well, I think.
Yeah.
TV, which are really good. You think you can watch them on YouTube, but not that I've done that. But it's quite interesting to see to what extent an individual can reflect much wider trends. Anyway, I'm rambling. Does anyone else have any other questions for Emily? No? Okay. Well, thanks again, Emily, for a really interesting paper. And thanks again to Livia as well for another fantastic paper. Again, 2 fantastic papers. And thanks again everyone for joining us. In 2 weeks' time, we have 2 papers. One is by Veronica, who was here earlier, about treason in the print shop in the 1660s. And we also have Paul Hewitt talking again in a similar kind of theme about intellectual movements in the 1970s. And it would be great to see you all there as well. So thanks for coming. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
I think we'll end the seminar there.
Thank you.
Thank you.